Hi, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Eric Brown. I work here at the Institute, and thank you all for joining us on this rainy spring day. A special welcome to friends and colleagues who have traveled from far away, including Japan and New Zealand. To the Kiwis, I want to express my deepest condolences and solidarity in the wake of the terrorist attacks on the citizens of Christchurch and your nation. Our panel discussion today, of course, is on securing the peace in Oceania, which has rapidly become a locus of intensifying power competition in Asia. In recent years, the People's Republic of China has become something of a geoeconomic supernova as it has pursued an all-azimuth course of strategic aggrandizement across the Eurasian landmass, into South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as across the seas. Throughout Oceania, which lies in the heartland of the Pacific, PRC has dramatically enlarged its economic and other involvements, establishing itself recently as the top investor in the many Pacific Island countries and their second largest donor of overseas aid. Chinese business and trade with the Pacific nations is nothing new, nor are the Chinese Communist Party's far less benign actions there, including its efforts to isolate Taiwan diplomatically. What is new about the PRC's dramatic expansion into Oceania is that it is clearly directed by its ruling party state, and that it is generating unprecedented levels of indebtedness of some Pacific islands to China. The PRC also seems intent on translating the dependencies that it's trying to create into strategic leverage and position. It may be only a matter of time before we see a PLA, Army, Navy forward operating base established in Oceania, and this has far-reaching consequences for the security and strategic construction of the whole of the Pacific. The last 40 years of peace in Asia have been enormously good to the Pacific Rim countries which skirt Oceania, especially so for China, and we should be asking ourselves why China's communist rulers now appear so intent on remaking that liberal order which has sustained this peace, and what needs to be done to keep the peace and extend it farther and deeper into the future. Among other things, that requires acknowledging that the liberal order, while good for many, has not been especially good for many Pacific Island countries. Geographically isolated, many of these small countries have been left out and have been facing a raft of economic, governance, and environmental problems, which arguably have been made worse by policy neglect by the advanced democracies of the Pacific Rim. And it is in this policy vacuum that the PRC has taken advantage of opportunities there and used them for its own gain. As a result, the governments of Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and the United States have all begun strategic rebuilds of their national policies toward Oceania and their engagement with the Pacific Islands. We're here today to discuss these developments and about the ways the advanced democracies of the Pacific might best cooperate to preserve and improve the liberal order and promote security, commerce, and exchange that benefits the Pacific Islands and their people. For this panel, I'm really happy to delighted 5 people with an enormous amount of expertise and insight into alliances across the Pacific Rim as well as the Pacific Islands themselves. I'm pleased first off to welcome back the Honorable Hideshi Tokuchi, the noted scholar and diplomat who is Japan's first Vice Minister of International Affairs. I'm also happy to welcome the always insightful Dr. James Cladd, who was formerly the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense for Asia-Pacific Security Affairs and is now a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. Then we'll hear from 2 Pacific Island specialists that I've learned a great deal from. Dr. Anna Paulus from Massey University in New Zealand, and Dr. Noriyuki Sagawa from Kindai University in Osaka, Japan. And last, we'll hear from my colleague here at Hudson, Dr. John Lee, who before joining us back at the Institute most recently served as the National Security Advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Thank you. With that, Hideshi-san. Well, thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me thank the Hudson Institute for inviting me to this wonderful conference, and my special thanks go to you, Eric, and also to many people in this institute, including Dr. Satoru Nagao, just over there, and Dr. Weinstein, the president of this institute. Thank you very much for making my trip to and stay here in Washington, D.C. possible. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, since the 1980s, we are accustomed to use the word Asia-Pacific. As a geographic concept, it covers a huge part of the globe, leading the growth of this planet. The sense of community has grown over there. However, when we began to use the term Asia-Pacific, the main purpose was to emphasize that the U.S. is integrated into the Pacific and to East Asia. I hope that the United States itself is conscious that it is a Pacific power. And also Australia is a staunch ally of the United States and more inclined to be integrated into Asia. And New Zealand is coming back to the U.S. alliance network, and it remains a part of the Five Eyes community together with Australia. And we do not overlook these countries either, but we have to overlook the center of the Pacific. Today, a new nomenclature, Indo-Pacific, is rapidly replacing the word Asia-Pacific. But its focus is more westward. The focus of the Indo-Pacific is much on the Indian Ocean. If you look at the region from the Indian side eastward, the scope of the Indo-Pacific often stops at the Western Pacific. Of course, it is changing, but still I have that kind of impression. And the Pacific Island nations are not in its scope, very unfortunately. However, if the Indo-Pacific is the maritime underbelly of Asia, the Pacific Island nations are the underbelly of Hawaii, namely the home of U.S. Indo-PACOM, which is the locus of the U.S.-centered alliance network in the Pacific region and the final guarantor of the regional order. Today, the South Pacific Island region is the place in which national interests of a number of major powers are involved. Powerful neighbors, Australia and New Zealand, powers with a historic background of the regions, namely Japan and the United States, and in addition to the UK and France have been deeply involved. And then the region has become a venue for competition for diplomatic relationship between Taiwan and China. China's influence in that region is growing. Economic aid, cultural exchange, presence of China's diaspora, infrastructure investment. These are the main tools of China's operations. A top donor to this region remains Australia. The second and third biggest donor are China and New Zealand. The amount of aid from these two countries is roughly 1/6 the amount Australia donated, but the amount by Australia is declining. And in Fiji, for example, the amount of donation from China is bigger than that from Australia. For another example, although there are some countries in the region, such as Samoa and the Cook Islands, which are managing the loan from China as well, there are some other countries, such as Tonga, which have a huge debt problem in relation with China. And cultural exchanges include one Confucius Institute in Fiji, one Confucius classroom in Vanuatu, one Confucius classroom also in the Cook Islands, and one Confucius Institute in Samoa, and two Confucius Institutes in Papua New Guinea. In terms of Chinese diaspora, 20,000 in Fiji and 10,000 in Papua New Guinea out of a total 70,000 in the Pacific Island region. China's infrastructure investment in that region includes port facilities in Fiji, PNG, and Vanuatu, on which there is a growing concern about China's military use. China's main motives are considered to be following three reasons. First, 3 points. First, to decrease the international space for Taiwan. Second, to pursue maritime interests, particularly fishery interests. The exclusive economic zone total of the Pacific Island nations is four times as large as Japan's EEZ. Waters near the coast of China are not good for fisheries anymore. And the Chinese have to depend much more on ocean fishery. Third, geopolitical consideration. The Pacific Island nations are located in the southern flank of Indo-Pacific of the United States. Geography of these nations is instrumental to hold the US military forces in check. On the other hand, the Pacific Island nations have a bigger voice in the international discussion on climate change. And what they are saying about this issue draw much attention of the international community. Namely, not only countries having traditional ties with these countries, but also many others are paying attention to this region. Accordingly, the Pacific Island nations have more chances and challenges in their relations with the world. After World War I, Japan held mandates over Pacific Islands north of the equator. Japan fought against the Allied powers in World War II in some parts of the Pacific Island region. Today, the region accepts a great deal of Japan's economic assistance. However, the Japanese did not pay much attention to the region. The situation is changing now. If you look at Japan's new national defense policy adopted just last December, called National Defense Program Guidelines. You'll find a reference to defense cooperation and exchanges with the regional countries for the first time in the history of Japan's defense policy. This reference to the Pacific Island region does not come up very abruptly. Japan's naval force has been participating in the US Pacific Fleet's Pacific Partnership Program, PPP, for years and visiting the region occasionally. Fiji was invited to the Tokyo Defense Forum, an annual multilateral conference the Ministry of Defense of Japan hosts in March last year for the first time. And Nippon Foundation donated Coast Guard patrol boats to Palau. The paragraph I have quoted in the new paragraph about the defense cooperation with the Pacific Island nations, as I referred to a little bit, follows an extension of these experiences. It is a part of Japan's response to rapidly shifting balance of power in the region and to the growing uncertainty on the international order. So some parts of the region are located between the first and second island chains in the Western Pacific. The southern end of the second island chain is Micronesia and Papua New Guinea. Growing influence of China in the region necessitates our closer attention to the Pacific Island nations. Geopolitical security interests are not the only consideration. Fishery resources are rich. Energy resources such as LNG are also important for Japan. Japan has a number of common interests with the island nations, including natural disasters prevention and relief, protection of marine environment, and of fishery resources. Japan can extend the helping hands to these developing countries by various means, such as infrastructure building, maritime security and safety capacity building, and human resource development. Well, attention to this region is growing. Demand for investment is growing. Rationales for cooperation are many. However, Japan cannot go alone to cooperate with these fragile island nations in addressing diverse challenges they face. Well-coordinated collaboration among like-minded countries must, as the US provides military security to Palau, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia by Compact of Free Association. Coordination with the US is particularly important, critically important. So I would like to conclude this presentation with the following 3 points, just in brief. First, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision is not well understood in the regional countries, I hear, as they are much about their as they care much about their fishery resources, I hear that there is a misunderstanding on their part that we demand them to open their fishery zones for us free of charge. It may or may not be a joke, but anyway, we have to win their full understanding of our free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And second, they need assistance, but they are not our subordinates. We are equal as partners. There are multiple perspectives on the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and there is no unified vision among various like-minded countries. However, there is a convergence of some key principles, including the rule of law. It is important not to dictate the principles to the island states. A careful approach is necessary. And finally, a whole-of-government approach is more important than ever because both geopolitical perspective and geo-economic perspectives are necessary to shape the order in this region, in this connected world. I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hideshi-san. James.
Thank you, Eric. And good afternoon. I want to extend my condolences to my fellow New Zealanders for the terrible events of last week. I had the enormous advantage, as well as working for Robert Gates when he was Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, to actually long ago be in the New Zealand Foreign Service. So it gave me a perspective on the region, which I think still has some utility, although my 20-year-old son is always accusing me of being, quote, so 20th century, unquote, that you'll have to make a decision as about how useful that is. What I want to do today is not impose on your patience, but say two things that may be of some possible utility to you. The first is looking at the enduring characteristics of the South Pacific area. And again, I'm dating myself by calling it the South Pacific, but it's a region which has a great deal of variety, and there's a temptation in Washington to treat it as a one-size-fits-all exercise. The second thing is some cautionary thoughts in that vein for US policymakers. So, launching straight into the 20th century part, I think we forget that the decolonization into little elements of state sovereignty in the South Pacific occurred at kind of the same time as the winds of change in Africa, with some similar issues, a neo-colonial arrangement, a neo-colonial elite, comfortable working relationships. It's just that the size of these sovereignties was smaller, but the departing colonial powers did very little to advance the possibility of economies of scale in the way that was attempted in Africa with the East African Union, Federation of Rhodesia, Nyasaland, etc. They didn't work, and one of the constraints of the South Pacific has always been not just size and distance, but an inability to maximize economies of scale potential, seen in things like the difficulty in establishing a regional shipping line and that type of thing. It's important to understand that much of what we're seeing today has its antecedents. The Chinese activity goes back to the 1970s when the triads, the criminal organizations in both the mainland and especially Taiwan, were buying passports from Tonga. Again, there's repetitions of issues which don't seem to be initially to have much grounding in the past, but we have to avoid the temptation to think of all of it as terribly new. In my own mind, I regard what China's doing as not particularly new, just the scale of it, enhanced by the ability to rely on the overseas Chinese networks, is new and different. For Australia, New Zealand, Europe as well, the old connectivities are fading. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, I asked my deputy, who was a decorated Marine Corps general, 3-star, to go visit some of these countries and greet some of the passing generation of coast watchers, people who'd been influential in helping during the Pacific Theater. That happened, and that was 10 years ago. The connectivities are fading, the habits of dealing with one another are fading, and the post-independence elite of these countries is different from the one that was initially there. The Taiwan question is both new and also not new. There's a recent piece in the National Bureau of Asian Research by Denny Roy, which looks at the way in which Taiwan can find a room with this free and open Indo-Pacific idea, which, by the way, it's not just the Pacific countries that are baffled by it. I find a lot of trouble, sense of what does it really mean, and whether it's anything more than convenient wallpaper for each of the four major people in the quadrilateral arrangement to think about what they're doing. So maybe it's good that it's loosey-goosey and hard to determine, because anything that's fixed is going to invite dissent from it, which would be capitalized. Another thing that's enduring is state capacity and the lack thereof in the region. The way in which you've got Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, all really different, culturally different, and in the post-independence paths they've taken very different as well. So that's, in a sense, the continuities, and we've seen continuities reestablished by the Pacific reset of the New Zealand Foreign Minister Winston Peters, with whom I worked 10 years ago to try to defang the nuclear ship issue. I think it's a very interesting thing. It has his total commitment, as I understand. I met him last year when he was greeting the Papua New Guinea foreign minister. There is a sense that New Zealand's stepping up, and I invite you to look at Foreign Minister Peters' speech at Georgetown last December. Also, to have a look, if you have a chance, at the New Zealand Statement on Defense last year, in which China is, when a statement of general principles, China is never mentioned, but all of the activities that don't meet approval from the New Zealand government are mentioned loud and clear. And then there's a separate question on trying to encourage the Chinese to get in the broader game, the regime of international rules. Let me just finish with some thoughts on what may work for an American rekindled interest in the Pacific. 3 days ago, Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal wrote an op-ed, which I broadly think is okay, although the idea of, in the Washington mindset anyway, the Pacific Island states being geopolitical flashpoints, quote unquote, still seems a little bit remote. Similarly, he described them as tiny, inaccessible island states. Well, the whole thing about globalization is they're not inaccessible. Migration has people moving to Auckland, Sydney, a number of places, and these places are basically being depopulated and still have the accoutrements of sovereignty. So we've got the following situation, and this should inform American thinking about reordering its relations with the Pacific in the following ways. We have a rapprochement with New Zealand, which is very solid. Call it security partnership, but it's very solid, very strong, and it simply points to more collaboration in the future. Similarly, Australia has had its own reset last year, dealing with China, thinking about how they can make an impact on Chinese policy, and deciding, even with their lack of complete confidence that they knew who was in charge here from day to day, they felt that they could go ahead and speak in terms of national security. I think a coordinated response by Washington with allies and security partners is a very good way to bring alliances up to speed that is 21st century and not 20th century. Speaking of ANZUS, or the security partnership with New Zealand, but really collaborating with those countries and with Japan, which has an extraordinary set of relationships in the region, will leverage American influence and resources far better than attempting to announce an independent way of doing it. And then finally, to remember that there are other people out there who, exactly in a parallel to our security relationships, can be brought into the game. The French, measured between what was going on 10 years ago and now, are extraordinarily obliging and are doing very interesting things. They have to do things in ways that are cognizant of their relationships with China, just as with Britain, as with New Zealand, as Australia, everything else. But they're an important player and they should be brought in. I'll leave it at that. Hope I haven't overdone my time.
No,
and hope this is useful.
Good. It is very useful. Thank you. Anna.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again to Eric for the invitation to be here again. It's great to be back at the Hudson Institute, speaking about very similar issues this year as well. So what I'd like to do today, the topic of the conversation was really about cooperation in the region and what liberal democracies can do to cooperate better across the Pacific Islands region. But what I'd like to do, given the speed of which activity and the geopolitical shifts have taken place in the Pacific Islands region, I'd like to just take a moment to take stock of a few things. And I'd like to start by looking and challenging the dominant strategic narrative that has emerged as a consequence of these geopolitical shifts. And then I'd like to identify some of the fault lines and disruptors in the region, and then end with some of the sort of first principles of engagement as we think about how to engage with the region more deeply. So as we've already heard on the panel, we know that the Pacific Islands region has become increasingly contested and complex over the past few years as a consequence of external engagement. And this really emerged as a result out of years of benign neglect on the part of the Pacific's traditional, so-called traditional partners, primarily Australia and New Zealand, but others as well. And China, by default as well as by design, has filled that vacuum very successfully. And two questions have really dominated China's involvement over the past few years in the Pacific. And the first has been, to what degree is China shaping the regional order in the Pacific Islands? And to what degree can we shape China's activities in the Pacific? And I think we probably know the answer to the second one, more than the first, actually. And these realizations very quickly led to a strong sense of strategic anxiety across the Pacific region. And that, in turn, has led to this dominant strategic narrative about how to respond to the rise of China and its influence in the Pacific. And that narrative is fairly linear and at times quite one-dimensional. It's a narrative that demands far greater nuance than we necessarily see with it. It puts a great deal of stock, a great deal of focus on the geopolitical interests and geopolitical contestation in the region. And what is missing from this is a connection, a greater understanding of the local and sub-regional dynamics that are very much active in the region. The region's complexities, both at the local level and at the national level, which are in turn informing what is happening at the broader regional level as well. And disturbingly, much of that strategic debate that has occurred about the Pacific, whether that be in Wellington or in Canberra or here in DC or in London or in Tokyo, has really focused on the broader geopolitical issues, really subordinating some of those local dynamics, which are absolutely critical to understanding that interface, that intersectional nexus between the sub-regional dynamics and the wider regional dynamics. And when we talk about which many of the conversations have been around organizing the geopolitical space in the Pacific, we cannot lose sight of what's happening at that local and national level, because ultimately it will be one of the key determining factors. So what concerns some of us about the strategic narrative that's emerged within the region and about the region, more importantly, has been that it will lead to narrow calculations based on material power, and undermine genuine understanding of the complexities of the Pacific Islands region. And this has very much been picked up by leadership within the Pacific. Last month in Vanuatu, Dame Meg Taylor, who is the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, said unequivocally and with a great deal of frustration that she rejected, on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum, rejected the terms of the dilemma which present the Pacific with a choice between a China alternative and our traditional partners. And she went on to say that this framing remains the dominant narrative in the public debate about our region in the context of today's geostrategic competition. And this speaks to a very strong concern within the region too, that Pacific voices and Pacific perspectives have been neglected, have not been included in this debate too. And that ties in slightly to what your comments around the free and open Indo-Pacific, which I'll get to in a moment. So what is very clear is that the strategic narrative about the region needs to be far more nuanced than it currently is, because perspectives in the region are far more nuanced than are necessarily acknowledged. China, for instance, presents both opportunity as well as challenge to the Pacific Island states. And the language from the forum and from Pacific leaders has been very consistent about the call for cooperation rather than competition. And as Dame Meg also said, forum members view China's increased actions in the region as a positive development, one that offers greater options for financing and development opportunities, both directly in partnership with China and this is the important bit, indirectly through the increased competition in our region as a consequence of this geopolitical contestation. And we've seen, as already been mentioned, with the New Zealand Pacific Reset, from about 2017 onwards, we saw this recalibration of policies towards the Pacific, the New Zealand Reset, the step up from Australia, the UK's re-engagement, and of course the US greater interest as well, and as well as Japan and France too. So that brings me to some of the fault lines here. And given that the discussion today is about cooperation, I'd like just to touch on that briefly, not so much as a fault line, but as something to keep in mind when we think about cooperation. If those countries who are interested, who have a vested interest in building resilience within the regional order, within the Pacific regional order, in order to withstand the pressures of a buffeted international rules-based order, cooperation with the Pacific Islands themselves is absolutely fundamental. They need to be part of the conversation and are frequently not part of the conversation, part of the wider conversation. This means genuine, sustained commitment and not a reliance on, for instance, Australia or New Zealand to act as intermediaries in the conversation, or proxies, for instance. This means a commitment to the issues which are identified by the Pacific Islands Forum and Pacific Island leaders themselves as being paramount to their peace and prosperity and security. Number one of which, of course, is climate change. If we look for places, if we look for ideas around cooperation in the Pacific, they're all very much clearly laid out. We only have to turn to the framework for Pacific regionalism, or the regional policy on oceans governance, or even more recently, the Boy Declaration on regional security, which lays out 4 pillars of security which are impacting the Pacific. Climate change obviously being one, and HADAR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, human security, cyber, and transnational crime. The Pacific Islands have identified the areas where they are seeking greater cooperation, and these are the entry points where partners should be focusing most. But in terms of the fault lines themselves, a critical fault line or disruptor, obviously, is the geostrategic competition in the region itself. And the concern here for many is that this is actually undermining Pacific regionalism, which is at the very time when it needs to actually be strengthened. Perhaps more as a result of accident than by design, this includes both the pressures from China to shape a regional order more favorable to its own desires and priorities, namely a regional order that explicitly recognizes initiatives to create and duplicate regional architecture. We need to be very careful in that space particularly. And we need to be very conscious of the fact that this is a key point where multilateralism and the regional order and the regional architecture is absolutely fundamental if we are wanting to build resilience in the region, and fundamentally build resilience in such a way that meets Pacific priorities, Pacific Island identified priorities and agenda. And as I mentioned before, there is a deep-seated frustration, and a very legitimate frustration, that much of the debate is very one-dimensional and that fails to accommodate the non-traditional security issues which are paramount to Pacific Island countries. In the case, I'll just turn very briefly to the free and open Indo-Pacific. There was considerable frustration within the Pacific that they felt that they were left out of that conversation, left out of that discussion around what that would mean for the Pacific Island countries themselves. There was a strong concern that the context of where the Pacific fits into the broader Indo-Pacific, and regional leaders have asked this very question, but how does the Pacific maintain and strengthen its own strategic autonomy within this wider Indo-Pacific concept? How does the Pacific ensure regional priorities are neither undermined through the breaking of Pacific solidarity, nor appropriated by the narratives of others who are not of the region, but whose policies or approaches may be seeking to dominate? And this is why it's so fundamentally important that the way that re-engagement and stepped-up engagement in the region is framed, there is an enormous amount of cynicism in the Pacific Islands about why so many actors, both traditional and non-traditional, are re-engaging with the Pacific, are stepping up their engagement, why so many more resources are being allocated to the Pacific. And this is fueling cynicism and distrust amongst leaders in civil society and others across the region. These are very legitimate concerns because the Pacific Islands have seen geopolitical power struggles before. They've seen great powers come and go. What they are seeking is sustained engagement, sustained commitment. So what do first principles, what kind of first principles would potentially look like in terms of effective engagement in the region? I'll just very quickly touch on three here. Firstly, a willing to amplify rather than undermine regionalism is absolutely fundamental. To align as appropriate with Pacific Island narratives such as the Blue Pacific, the strategic ambitions laid out in the framework for Pacific regionalism, and as I mentioned before, an appreciation for the expanded concept of security in the Boy Declaration, which primarily identifies climate change as the existential threat facing the Pacific. This also means a commitment to Pacific principles around non-militarization of the region, and this is a highly significant concern increasingly over the last year. Second, a willingness to assist Pacific participation in the wider Indo-Pacific architecture so that Pacific Island countries and the region itself are not being spoken about, but actually have a seat at the table where they can present their concerns and priorities and determine their own strategic narrative within the broader context. Strengthening that interface is a very obvious and quite easy thing to do. Thirdly and lastly, and back to what I said at the very beginning, an appreciation of that interface, that nexus between the geopolitical and the sub-regional and local dynamics. There's a tendency to downgrade or subsume local dynamics under the broader umbrella of geopolitical contestation in the region, and to do so would be highly flawed. So I'll probably raise more sort of caveats around engagement than solutions for cooperation. But these are key things that I'd like us all to think about more deeply, and perhaps are open for discussion as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next we'll have Noriyuki Sagawa, who's been engaged in some very interesting diplomatic and initiatives with Pacific Islanders, and he'll speak to us a little bit about some lessons from the Tongan squash industry, among other things, for our economic engagement going forward. Noriyuki.
Thank you very much for kind introduction, Eric. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here as well. So my presentation focused on economic development in Pacific Island countries. And Eric, can I use the PowerPoint?
Yeah, do we have the PowerPoint?
Cannot. No. Okay. Yeah, because my pronunciation is lousy, so it's better to show the PowerPoint, I think. Yeah, but anyway, the Pacific Island countries have geographical disadvantages, small land area and population, scattered islands and population. These two factors prevent mass production and stable production. And remoteness, the Pacific Island countries are located far from major markets, such as the United States, China, Japan, and Europe as well. So it is very difficult for Pacific Island countries to develop export industries and achieve economic self-reliance. But it is very important to think about the development of industries, because our support to develop industries and promote investment and trade contributes to not only economic development of Pacific Island countries, but also the development of human resources and people-to-people exchanges. And it leads to the development of our relationship with Pacific Island countries and expansion of our influence in that region. So besides ODA, the private sector also play an important role in the expansion of our influence in Pacific Island countries. So today I'm going to explain how government and private sectors in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan can contribute to the sustainable economic development of Pacific Island countries through exploring success and the decline of squash industry in Tonga. I think this case studies gives us a hint of how we can respond to increasing influence of China in this region. The first, I'd like to explain about the success of squash industry in Tonga. The squash industry in Tonga was mainly for export to Japan. In Japan, from November to December, squash cannot be produced. Then, to fill this Japanese market niche, Tonga started cultivating squash in 1987. And in peak period, more than 15,000 tons, and sometimes more than 20,000 tons of squash were exported to Japan annually. And squash export constituted about 42 to 45% of total export in Tonga. Wow. And about 15 to 20% of working population engaged in squash industry. So squash industry was an important driver of economic development in Tonga. This case indicates just production and export of one commercial crop has a very strong impact on economic development in Pacific Island countries. And I think, this is my opinion, the Pacific Island countries have possibility to become a food supply center of Japan because currently the Japanese food self-sufficiency rate is less than 40% at the moment. And in the near future, the percentage will decrease. And if commercial crops can be produced under the name of Japanese brand, I think the crops can be exported not only Japan, but also other Asian countries, because in Asian countries, especially vegetables and the fruits with Japanese brand are very popular. So I think agriculture industry has potential to drive economic development in Pacific Island countries. And of course, it is very important to think about to add values by processing a crop. In addition, towards further expansion of agriculture industry and economic development, with the cooperation of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other democratic countries, the introduction of preferential treatments in trade, especially quota preference, that was held in STABEX in Lome Convention 1975 to stabilize export earnings.
What's this for the?
Yep.
Just to click through your slides, thank you.
Yep, here. Yeah, so introduction of the quota preferences, which was held in STABEX in Lome Convention 1975, to stabilize export earnings from agricultural products can be considered, although this idea is not in accordance with WTO regulations. In year 2005, the Small Island Developing State Conference, small island countries requested to have preferential treatments in trade, but at that time it was rejected. But since that time already 15 years passed, but the economic situation in Pacific Island countries do not have a big change. So I think we have to think and we have to implement something new. Yeah. So the introduction of, for example, quota preferences can be considered, I think. And next, I'd like to see the decline of the squash industry. Since year 2006, squash industry has declined. Decline of this industry is mainly attributed to weak management and weak governance. The number of squash farmers increased from only 40 in 1987 to around 2,000 in 1999. And the number of squash exporters also increased from 2 in 1989 to 15 in 2005. I think normally people in Pacific Island countries tend to pursue quick profit. So that's why the number of farmers and exporters drastically increased. And the government did not control it, and there were no structures and regulations systems to control it. As a result, there was overproduction and there was domestic competition. And finally, Scotch industry declined. So this case indicates for the sustainable economic development, the establishment of management system and improvement of governance are necessary. So I'd like to suggest that government and private sectors in democratic countries to support the establishment of management system and the development of human resources connecting to good governance. And I think Pacific Island countries need human resources who can have long-term vision of state building. And I also think because of lack of these human resources, some Pacific Island countries have been falling into debt trap of China. So to develop economy in Pacific Island countries and to protect their sovereignty, human resource development is very important. And I also would like to say that we have to now reconsider what kinds of human resources are necessary for the development of Pacific Island countries and how we can develop human resources. I think almost all Pacific Island countries do not understand which area is a priority area for their development. And also, we do not think deeply about which area is a priority area for the development. And we have to remember one thing, the human resource development policies to send government officials and consultants to the departments and ministries in Pacific Island countries have sometimes been criticized as neo-colonialism and sometimes caused the deterioration of the relationship with Pacific Island countries. Then I'd like to suggest our democratic countries to spend more time for discussion with Pacific Island countries to understand their needs, find a priority area, and lead them to right direction in state building.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you very much. Pronunciation, by the way, was excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And very enlightening.
I'm really worried about that.
My deepest apologies for the PowerPoint snafu, but John.
Thank you, Eric. The point has been made by a few panelists that China has lots of other interests besides strategic and security interests in the Pacific, and that's certainly true. I'm just going to spend my period of time talking about China's security strategic interests in the context that these are not China's only interests, but they are an increasing part of why China is interested in the region. Let me first take you to a very different part of the world. And I've been watching what China's been doing in Djibouti, which is a tiny country in Horn of Africa, over the last few years. Djibouti is situated to the south of the Gulf of Aden, so it's extremely strategic real estate. Now, I disagree with the viewpoint that the Pacific Islands are becoming a flashpoint. I think we need to be careful about that term. But certainly there is strategic contestation. It is not yet a flashpoint, but bear that in mind as I make these strategic comments about China's interests. Now, Djibouti doesn't have much going for it economically, but for many years it has been very good at extracting rents from major powers, the Americans, the Japanese, the French, and the Germans, for strategic use of its territory. From early this decade, China began to take an interest in Djibouti. It began with the state-owned China Merchant Holdings purchasing a large stake in a port of Djibouti for about $185 million. Now, to sweeten that deal, Beijing threw in an offer to develop the port's facilities and awarded state-owned China State Construction Engineering Corporation a $420 million contract to begin work. China promised to improve the infrastructure supporting that port's functions. This included a railway to Ethiopia and 2 international airports. Now, having gained the formal lease for facilities, in favor of the local government through financial offerings, China began the gradual militarization of what was meant to be civilian facilities. Just months after opening the logistics facility, China began military training and live-fire exercises to explore, quote, the model of overseas military deployment and improve the Chinese troops' ability to comprehensively maneuver weapons and conduct diversified military missions. The military mission of personnel stationed in Djibouti has been expanded beyond anti-piracy and counter-terrorism to provide, quote, humanitarian assistance and contribute to, quote, peace and stability of Africa. This military mission creep is complemented by additional Chinese financing for civilian and military dual-use projects, such as new ports and railways, water supply, and energy transportation facilities. And they've even created a US $3.5 billion zone of hope free trade area covering 30 square miles, linking Djibouti with Ethiopia, Rwanda, Somalia, and Sudan using Chinese finance. These infrastructure developments, which include military-capable facilities, are considered part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Although, caveat, everything is considered part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Despite earlier Chinese denials of mission creep when the logistics facility was first proposed, we now basically have the situation of a permanent Chinese military base in Djibouti. Now, as I mentioned, the South Pacific is not the Horn of Africa, but Chinese military officials do look at the South Pacific in some similar ways. They frequently point to the South Pacific as integral to China's grand strategy as part of a greater periphery approach. As mentioned by one of my panelists, the South Pacific, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, sits just outside the so-called second island chain, which is an area, if you draw an imaginary line from the east coast of Japan through Guam, Micronesia, and it ends in the western regions of Papua New Guinea. China's focus is currently on acquiring the capacity to break out of or else operate freely within this so-called first island chain, which is an imaginary line drawn from Japan through Taiwan, the west of Philippines, Brunei, and the east coast of Indochina. Now, the PLA Navy cannot become a genuine Pacific naval power without the capacity to break out and operate freely beyond the first island chain, meaning it must be able to repel or deter counter-naval actions around the eastern periphery of the second island chain, which is precisely where the South Pacific Islands are generally located. In fact, the Chinese are good students of military history, and this is precisely how the Imperial Japanese Navy thought about the value of the South Pacific earlier last century. Let me just return to the Djibouti analogy. So the economic components of the Djibouti approach are already well underway. China is the largest trading partner of the Pacific Island foreign member countries taken together, if you exclude Australia and New Zealand. With respect to Chinese official development assistance given to the PIF countries, over 80% of it is in concessionary loans, with remainder grants. Chinese concessionary loans have increased from almost zero to over $1.3 billion in that region within a decade. And they impose interest rates of around 2 to 3%. In addition to the substantial capital injected into Fiji, Chinese loans account for more than 60% of Tonga's total external debt and almost half of all the external debt owed by Vanuatu. Incidentally, Fiji and Tonga are the only two Pacific Island countries with permanent standing militaries. In strategic terms, I think the case of Vanuatu is potentially more serious. There was a report quoting senior Australian security officials, and I know who they are, that China and Vanuatu were in discussions to build a military-capable base in Luganville Wharf, which has been funded by a Chinese loan and completed in mid-2017. Our report was subsequently denied by both countries, but only after it became a front-page news story and caused considerable outrage within Vanuatu and a number of other countries. The Vanuatu situation reminds me of a comment a few years ago by Tonga's Prime Minister to an audience in New Zealand when he said that China might agree to write off Tonga's debt if Tonga agreed to a Chinese base. And there are also reports that that's precisely the conversation that took place between China and the previous government in Malaysia. The Djibouti model, as I call it, also shows how mission creep works and the eventual establishment of a dual-use facility might proceed if China acquires a logistics facility base in the South Pacific. China justifies the use of the PLA Navy, so do other countries, but China justifies the use of the PLA Navy to pursue and protect Chinese and community interests, the definition of which are ever growing broader and wider. These interests include responses to natural disasters, humanitarian relief, protection of Chinese nationals, workers, and even Chinese diasporas from acts of terrorism or civil disorder, and the safeguarding of Chinese commercial assets. These are in Chinese official policy documents. The use of the PLA Navy to protect Chinese interests and assets is formally classified as, quote, far seas protection operations to serve peacetime goals. Now, in this context, investment by Chinese firms and the presence of Chinese workers and Chinese diasporas would provide a pretext for an increased PLA Navy presence. According to defense white papers from China since 2012, the protection of overseas Chinese nationals is formally identified as a task of the PLA Navy. In 2013, there was an estimated 80 to 100,000 Chinese, ethnic Chinese people in the South Pacific, and that number would have increased since then due to Chinese workers in the region. To conclude, this is a summary of my takeaways, or what I hope are the takeaways. Now, there is nothing illegitimate about China using diplomacy and assistance and finance to acquire a greater influence and relevance in the South Pacific. And it is also impossible to prevent a greater Chinese economic footprint in the South Pacific. I also take well the point made by Anna that if you over-securitize everything in the Pacific, it tends to be counterproductive because the Pacific Island nations would not react well. When it comes to specific concerns in security or strategic terms, specific concerns I think we should have, I'll name 4 or 5. 1, China's use of ODA to win political favour, to steer countries towards it, and to secure exclusive privileges to assets, which would have negative strategic implications for the United States and other countries. The 2, the use of coercive economic methods that cause specific nations to abandon diplomatic relations with Taiwan. 3, the use of official assistance to finance projects that remain opaque with respect to the terms of the bargain and the future use of that asset. I emphasise that countries can arrive at any agreement they want with any country under any terms that they want. That's their right to do so. But when these are done under opaque conditions, it rarely serves the interests of those populations in those countries. 4, the offering of concessionary loans to create debt traps. And 5th, the development of dual-use facilities and increased militarization of these facilities, which is driven by the PLA Navy's mission creep in the region. Just to conclude, once again, I do emphasize that it is not all about security and strategic issues in the South Pacific. But I'd leave you with this thought: China wants a base in the South Pacific. Now, China may well get a base in South Pacific. If countries want to give China a base in South Pacific, that's their right to do so. But we want to make sure that governments enter into agreements with China, which are done in a transparent manner, which is what other countries, United States, Australia, New Zealand, etc., do in that region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should add that John has a policy paper, which if you haven't already gotten a copy of it, there's some available at the front desk, which among other things, in addition to touching on the issues that he spoke about, talks about some practical things that we, particularly here in Washington, could be thinking about in terms of how to reform and revise our foreign assistance, including in the Pacific Islands. I want to thank everybody as well for uniformly excellent and rich presentations that really lay out the complexities of what we're looking at in Oceania. And I also recognize that there's an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise in this room right now. So given that we're running out of time, I want to open it up to questions with all of you. After I call on you, if you could wait for the microphone to come to you, and please simply identify yourself, and let's do our best to keep the comments and questions as short as possible. Miss, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the forum today. My name is Connie Kim, reporter from Voice of America. I want to shift the focus a little bit to the U.S.'s allies' cooperation against North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. My first question I want to ask Mr. Kladd. The U.S. and Japan have stood very closely with each other on cooperating against North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. Recently, the U.S. Coast Guard deployed another patrol in the East China Sea in an effort to implement the UN sanctions against North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. I want to ask how you assess the two countries' cooperation in enforcing UNSC resolutions against North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. And then second question, I want to ask Mr. Hadeshi. So Japan has been in the forefront of getting allies such as Australia and New Zealand support in dispatching patrol aircrafts and vessels to Japan and the East China Sea for surveillance purposes. How do you think Japan will cooperate with its allies in also clamping down on North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers, and what is Japan's stance on this issue?
Thank you. James?
Yeah, it's been a few years since I've been involved with making defense policy for Asia, and I'm not privy to discussions or a daily briefing, much as I might like to be. But it actually goes to address your point, which is that is the type of thing that's held very close hold among friendly navies, and a degree of cooperation, which includes reconnaissance and surveillance stuff, happens with countries which would prefer not to be identified in the public domain. So that's pretty much what I can tell you, except that it's a reasonably successful effort, I understand, but again, I can't speak with any authority.
Well, actually, I didn't expect that kind of question in this forum, but you know, the North Korea is committed to denuclearization. Many people say so, but I strongly doubt it. Well, you know, it is easy for North Korea or its dictator, Kim Jong-un, to say he is or the country is committed to denuclearization. But what does it mean by, what do we mean by denuclearization? Probably our definition of denuclearization is different from their definition of denuclearization. Of course, it is very important for the president of this country get in touch with the dictator of North Korea because because of the effort of the United States, finally the leader of North Korea got to the negotiating table. So that's very important step. However, I do not think that North Korea did make a strategic decision to dismantle all the nuclear weapons. I strongly doubt it. Of course, the dual approach is necessary, engagement and sanction. But it seems to me that these days, the entire world, including the United States and European countries, are likely to focus much on the engagement side. So I think that now is the time to keep pressuring North Korea. So, from that point of view, any efforts to keep pressuring and to execute the UN sanction, that's important. So the watching, it is very important to keep vigilant against ship transfer.
Great, thank you. Sorry, here in the second row.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. One thing about China is it tends to look very long-term compared to our relatively shorter time frame. And one thing that's popping up in the longer time frame is the collection of manganese-based rocks that accumulate on the sides of many of these islands, particularly rich when it comes closer to the equator. There's a lot of good stuff in there. It's not just manganese. There's rare earths. There's palladium, platinum, and a lot of other good things. Not worth mining right now, but a few metal prices, particularly on some of the minor stuff, and you got yourself a real windfall. And no one in the West is looking at it now, even though we did in the 70s. So I'm wondering if, when you go through your geopolitical projections, if you couldn't include the possibility that one big, if not huge, driver of China's expansion to these otherwise geopolitically uninteresting places is, in fact, to get a lock on the manganese crusts and the minerals they contain.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, if I can just respond to that. There's actually an enormous amount of work done amongst Pacific Island countries themselves around these issues, particularly pertaining to deep sea mining, but also more broadly, just talking about including the development of national policies in order to be able to respond to the growing interest in mining these resources. So yes, that's certainly very much part of the conversation in the Pacific.
I would hope that, thinking out a stance to that issue, the U.S. would talk to New Zealand, which took a great lead in a lot of the sea negotiations in the 80s. And I remember as a new recruit hearing about manganese nodules. We didn't know what they were. It sounded like a new breakfast food cereal, but it's worth doing it. And I see Simon over there remembering manganese nodules. Did you ever work out what they were?
I wrote my dissertation on it.
Did you?
Oh, wow.
You're not kidding. And, I mean, do you mind? I'm sorry, but that's very intriguing. I've never met anyone who's done a dissertation on it.
There's a richer resource on the sides of the islands rather than on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
And they're easier to get to. So that's the current focus of interest.
Yeah. Well, the rare earth mineral thing is a huge issue at the moment in various areas of our industrial policy.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. Lise, in the back.
Hi, I'm Lisa Lord-Odgaard from the Hudson Institute. I'd like to ask John Lee a question. I think the situation you describe with China and the Pacific Islands is very much in line with patterns we see from other regions. And I would like you to comment on that. There is, though, one difference. For example, when you compare China's entrance in the Arctic, I think it's very similar to what you describe. But I don't think the military side to China's presence is very large and is not likely to be so either in the near future. It's more the economic, political, strategic presence that seems to be significant. So is these military plans that you described, do you think they're particular to China's sort of near abroad, or do you see it as a more global pattern? And for Anna, can you say something about, You said that the Pacific Island views were overlooked and weren't taken into account often, and their particular interests, and of course that's also seen elsewhere. But are there some countries that are better at addressing those views and those needs than others of those external powers that are active in the Pacific Island region? Thanks.
First of all, just to distinguish between the South Pacific and the Arctic, or China's interests, either Arctic or Antarctic. I think one of the differences is that South Pacific obviously are nations with populations living in there, so that changes the dynamic instantly. It also changes how you respond, which leads to my second question, response. We are seeing a pattern of China offering economic aid, largesse, loans, developing facilities, hoping for militarization or capability to militarize those facilities. So we've seen that in China, we've seen that in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, as I mentioned. And yes, I would put the South Pacific in that category. But initially, I made the comment that I wouldn't consider South Pacific a flashpoint because, for a couple of reasons. One, China hasn't made a full throttle go at the South Pacific, largely because, as a few panelists have mentioned, China's filling a vacuum, and that vacuum is sort of shrinking because other countries are responding and hope they respond the right way. And this leads to my second point, that despite my presentation focusing on security strategic aspects, I think much of this of the solution of our response isn't security or strategic. It is actually to work with these Pacific Island nations to give them options, and to ensure that they don't find themselves in a position where they are offering something to China that they either didn't intend or found themselves in a situation where that they felt stuck. So I'm not at all advocating for the an increase of frigates and battleships into the Pacific. What I'm saying is that we want to ensure that whatever decisions these nations make for their populations and as governments, one, they have alternatives. Two, they know exactly what decision they're making in the medium and long term. And three, we implement them in a way that works for them. And I think countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, United States, that's our competitive advantage. So I'm certainly not advocating for massive militarization of Pacific. In fact, the opposite, that if we do these non-security things well, we actually quite effectively play defense against what I think China's trying to achieve.
Great. Anna, perhaps in addition to addressing Lisa's question, you could also talk a little bit about how Pacific Rim countries can help strengthen some of the voices of regionalism and some of the regional institutions in the Pacific so that they can, in fact, have greater voice in determining the terms of different contracts that they enter into with PRC and others.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your question. So firstly, in terms of Pacific voices and perspectives being heard, there has been a real pushback in the last couple of years about Pacific perspectives not being included as part of the sort of geopolitical debate. But you need to go back a little bit because the dynamic shifted in about 2005, where it became increasingly clear, and there was an enormous activity amongst key Pacific Island countries and groupings as well within the Pacific to champion and advance their own interests and agendas. And a lot of that came about out of a frustration felt that Australia and New Zealand, particularly as members of the Pacific Islands Forum, they were not pursuing and not supporting the pursuit of Pacific priorities, that they were pursuing their own interests. Essentially. And we saw this particularly around climate change, but also around other issues as well. And that emerged into what's known as the Pacific diplomacy and the new Pacific diplomacy. It's sort of this renaissance. And we saw this real drive of identity-based agenda and issues-based agendas, which really projected the Pacific voice internationally. And as a consequence of that, and that wasn't necessarily picked up on immediately by those traditional partners, that came a little bit later, coinciding perhaps with increased recognition of China's role in the region. And as a consequence, there has been an effort to really recognize that partners in the region have not been, Pacific partners in the region have not been listened to and not been heard as much as they should be. If we are genuinely talking about an equal partnership between countries and peoples. The New Zealand Pacific Reset acknowledged that when it was launched by Winston Peters, and it sought to, through the 5 principles which underpin the reset, sought to address that, as well as by bringing in New Zealand's Pacific diaspora very strongly into the conversation as well, sought to address the fact that it needed to listen better and much more deeply. Other countries have also been picking up and are quite practiced at that. I mean, China, I've met Chinese diplomats in the Marshall Islands who speak fluent Marshallese, as well as across other parts of the Pacific as well. So they have learnt and understand very clearly the importance of relationships, and have sought to build that through understanding local languages and culture and so forth. And so they've been actually far more adept at doing that than a lot of the more so-called traditional partners have been in doing that too. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of your question, Eric, in terms of what partners can do, Pacific Rim partners can do, one of the most important things that I see is really strengthening that interface, strengthening the regional architecture, focusing efforts on strengthening the Pacific Islands Forum. And by strengthening, I don't necessarily mean that it needs strengthening, but rather institutionalizing those relationships with the forum and supporting the work that it does, because it's going to be needed more than ever in the years ahead. And it is a obvious entry point into building resilience in the region. And then also looking at the other areas of cooperation too, particularly around civil society, strengthening media freedom, strengthening the role of non-state actors, and ensuring that there are diverse range of voices at the table each time.
Great.
Thank you.
Sir, over here.
Hi, I'm Chris Rodeman. I'm a research fellow at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. I have a question. It's very specific and economic about fisheries. These fisheries seem to be, the EEZs owned by the Pacific Islands seem to be such a potential valuable asset. And in my former life as a naval officer, I saw very clearly that these fisheries are coveted by the Chinese and to a lesser extent Vietnamese fishing fleets. Are these fisheries valuable to these nations? Are they profiting from them? And if not, why not? And can we help them make these valuable and sustainable assets?
That's a great question. Noriyuki, would you like to?
Yes, I think that is sustainable, but just Pacific Island countries think just to receive the fishing fee. So, yeah, the sustainable, but Pacific Island countries do not take a fish, just get money from developed country.
I guess my question really is, why don't they have partnerships?
If I could just add a couple of things as well. And I'm not a fisheries person at all, but I strongly recommend that you have a look at what the Foreign Fisheries Agency have done in this space. Fisheries is obviously one of the most critical resources, and it's not just the Chinese DWFNs, but other, the Spanish, the Europeans have been plundering the Pacific for quite some time. The numbers around illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing are incredibly high. And so they are making a loss. The Pacific Island countries are making a loss in that respect. And that's absolutely critical when you think about how much money could then be going into things like healthcare, education, resilience against climate change, and so forth. So it is imperative that more is done to safeguard fisheries. And under the Blue Pacific, the concept of the Blue Pacific, which is linked through to the UN Sustainable Goals around the oceans, around sustainability of oceans, including the resources and both coastal and marine resources. It is very much a focus of the Pacific Islands Forum and the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. But again, more needs to be done to actually regulate and to in terms of trying to prevent more illegal fishing, the amount of illegal fishing that's done there. So, and that's one of the reasons behind New Zealand's purchasing of the P8s was to provide that capability as well. But again, it's an enormous ocean, and much more can be done in that space. And I know the US are actively involved with Tonga and the Coast Guard in that space, but still, it is a fundamental resource, and it's only going to become more contested as well, particularly in the Central and Western Pacific.
The fisheries situation, as you know, is one of the reasons why there's a priority on information exchange amongst maritime countries and improving maritime awareness. It really has to be pushed ahead. Bill, here in the front row.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everybody, for your presentations. Very good. And I just want to mention on fisheries that I think that's one of the best examples of regional cooperation. That's where it's strongest, and that's because there's an economic return. A lot of the Pacific regionalism that hasn't worked is where the economics just don't add up. Sorry, from the Embassy of Australia, and spent a lot of my time working in Papua New Guinea and across the Pacific Islands. I just, not so much a question, but just an observation, which is when you think about what can the US do, I just want to not let the moment pass without noting that the freely associated states, particularly the compact arrangements with the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia, that's coming up for review. There are colleagues from the State Department here who know that very well, but I don't think many other people have focused on it, and it's a huge strategic moment for those countries and for the US. So if there was one thing that the US can do is do that well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for
Good point.
bringing that up. Thank you very much. Satoru, Dr. Nagao in the back.
Thank you very much. My question is, my name is Satoru Nagao, Japanese in Hudson Institute. And my question for John Lee. If China set up the naval base in Fiji, where it is located between US and Australia, what kind of option US-Australia can do is my question. Thank you very much.
Might have to ask the guy from the embassy, I think. Look, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously our priority is to, prevent that or dissuade Fiji or any other country from allowing that to occur. Look, if China set up a fully functioning naval base in Fiji, it would change Australia's strategic calculations and presumably, therefore, Australia's strategic and military posture. I'm not therefore saying that it'll be, suddenly a whole-scale militarization of the surrounding regions, but if you look at, I can only speak for Australia, if you look at our defence postures and military strategies, they don't account for there being a potentially hostile naval base in the South Pacific. So that's all I can really say. It would change our defence posture significantly.
Thank you all very much for coming, and I really want to thank all of our speakers today for really everything that you've brought to this discussion, and I hope that we can do it again. Thank you again.